Righto, good morning, grade 10s. This is my first attempt of making a video and not actually teaching you. So bear with me if it goes sideways, then we will have to redo it. All right, guys, we're going to start with the French Revolution this morning. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run through the PowerPoint with you. On the D6, you would have had the different exercises, activities that you needed to complete. But I feel if I just quickly run through the work with you, then that might assist you. So follow, and then of course you can pause and listen again if you don't understand. Now, French Revolution started 1789 and ran until approximately 1815. Now, the French Revolution is one of those events in the world history that was really important, as it was the revolution that started our way of life. And it is important that we understand how the French Revolution started and why it started. So let's get going. First, we need to understand what is a revolution. All right, guys, a revolution, as you can see there, is when great or dramatic changes happen. Now, a revolution is not always blood, it's not always fighting, it's not always people dying, killing each other. Revolution can be a number of things. A revolution can be a bloodless revolution. It can be an industrial revolution. It can be a revolution that a political revolution. So it is many things. It is not only a revolution as in overthrowing a government. If we look at the world today, currently we are going, as we know, through the fourth industrial revolution, which means that, as I'm doing now, we can communicate quite easily without actually being in sight of each other and without you sitting in front of me in a classroom. I can still teach you. It's not as entertaining for me, certainly, and I'm sure it's not for you as well, but it is still possible for me to teach you over a distance, and that's part of the fourth industrial revolution. So that is quite interesting. Now, if we look at the French Revolution, that was indeed a political revolution, and a political revolution means that there is a total change in the system of government, and usually a revolution starts when the people of a country is unhappy, and they have been unhappy for a long time. And then they rise up and they overthrow the rulers and establish their own government. Now, this is not always such a simple task, and it is sometimes it can happen that you have a revolution like we had in South Africa in 1994. This is a revolution in a sense, but that was a peaceful revolution. But people in South Africa was very unhappy for a very long time, and then in 1994, it wasn't an overthrow of the government, it was a democratic process, but it was a complete change of government, and therefore still stands as a political revolution. In France, however, we had a bloody revolution. There was a lot of bloodshed, a lot of people died, and it started with people being unhappy and with a government or a king that really didn't know what he was doing, and made the people so unhappy that in the end they decided that they are going to take matters in their own hands and they are going to overthrow. Now, usually a revolution starts where there is a promise of change, but it does not happen. If you promise somebody that something is going to change and then it doesn't, then people tend to get upset. When something stays the same and you never promise them a change, then they tend to accept it. But once you have promised them the change and you don't do it, then is when you're going to get yourself into trouble. Right, now this was the case in France. There was a body, call them a group of people or a meeting called the Estates General. And the Estates General was now the three different estates, and we will get to those estates in due course, so don't worry about that too much. And the king at the time, which was Louis XIV, called the Estates General together. And the people then hoped that the king would then change certain things. But this did not happen. And the king, even though he promised that he might change certain things, he didn't. And that then led to this revolution breaking out. In the UK, the king made reforms in the 17th century and he shared the power with Parliament. So there was no revolution. So in the UK, that's the United Kingdom, England today. No? The king decided that certain reforms were needed and he started sharing his power with the people. And because he did that, there was no revolution. There was a smooth transition. And the king stayed, and we still have the monarchy in England today. We know that Elizabeth II is still the queen in England, and she's very old now, she's 96 or 97. But the monarchy is still there. And it's because the king in the 17th century made the right decision. Unlike Louis XIV in France, who made the wrong decision. And he decided that he's not going to change, he's not going to share power, and eventually he was going to pay the price for that. But we'll talk about that. On the other side of the scale in Russia at the time, there was a Tsar. Now, a Tsar is the same as a king or an emperor. He was an absolute ruler, and there was no hope of reform, and therefore there was no revolution. The revolution only came much later, in 1917. The Russian Revolution started. But the Tsar never gave anybody the option of change. He never promised it, and therefore he stayed the Tsar. And there was no hope, and there was no revolution. So all revolutions, as I said, are not political. For instance, there's industrial revolutions, cultural revolutions, technology revolutions, like we are now in the fourth industrial revolution. All right, now let's quickly look at the conditions in France, 1789, that made the revolution possible. First of all, the political system. France was an absolute monarchy. And as we now know, the States General, they were elected officials and they could only meet if the king called them together. And at that point in 1789, they did not meet for about 175 years. The king, it's Louis XVI, could jail people without a trial, he could decide if you said something against the king that he would throw you in jail, and he could make those decisions. But we also need to understand about Louis XVI that he was the king because his father was the king. He did not want to be the king, but he had no choice in the matter. So he wasn't a very effective king. He wasn't a very good king. It was perhaps not his fault because he was not given the option. He didn't apply for the job. He was simply the king because his father was the king and he was the eldest son, and therefore he had to be king. He didn't really have a choice to abdicate, and to abdicate to mean is not to be the king any longer. He decided he was going to be the king, but he didn't really take it very, very seriously. And that was a problem at that particular point in time. Second one is the economic situation in France at the time was not very good. It was, in fact, was very bad. France was in debt because they were involved in a number of wars in the 1700s. The government borrowed large amount of money to pay these wars. In 1780, France had to borrow money to cover the interest on their debt. And that's quite an interesting one. If you have so much debt that you have to borrow money to cover the interest on the debt, to cover the interest on the money that you lend, then you know that you're in big trouble. Imagine you buy a house, but instead of paying back the house, you have to borrow money to pay the interest on the payment on the house. So therefore, you can't really afford the house in the first place. And that means basically, for all intents and purposes, that you are bankrupt. And that was the problem, that there was no more money. And then, of course, the lifestyle of the king cost a massive amount of money. It was a lavish lifestyle. He had parties, a lot of people that lived in Versailles. That was the name of the castle, the palace where he lived with his wife, Marie Antoinette. And that cost a lot of money. And the government simply could not collect enough taxes to pay all the debts. And the reason they couldn't collect enough taxes is because the wealthy people, the nobles and the clergy, that is the people, the landowners and the people of the church, did not have to pay any taxes. So in France at that point in time, the more you earned, the less taxes you paid. And the less you had, the more taxes you had to pay. So it's completely opposite of what it is today. Today, the more you earn, the more tax you have to pay, and that makes sense. because you have more money. So therefore, more of your money is going to go to the government, and the government's going to use that money in order to run the country. But in France at the time, the poor people had to pay all the taxes. Now, if you have nothing, how do you pay taxes? So that is now the middle class and the peasants. Now, the peasants were the farm workers, and the middle class, they were your merchants, your shop owners, teachers, lawyers, people that had no status. They didn't have any specific title, like a noble, like a count or a sir or something like that. They were just ordinary people, and they had to pay all the taxes, but they had nothing left to pay. So basically, France were in big economic trouble. Then the social structure, I just sort of referred to it. The French population was divided into 3 groups or classes. These groups were called estates. First estate was the clergy. Those were people who worked for the Roman Catholic Church, RCC. The church owned a large amount of land, and many of the high officials were very, very rich. The ordinary priests that worked with the people were not the problem. They were ordinary priests, ordinary clergymen, pastors, but the ones that were higher up in the church, they were the ones who owned a lot of land and also were very, very rich. And you were also, depending on who you were and who you knew, you were sort of elected, or they made you a bishop or whatever in the Roman Catholic Church. Second estate was the nobles. They inherited their titles. They had many special rights and a lot of many special privileges dating back to the time of the feudal system. Remember, we spoke about the feudal system. In the feudal system, those landowners that we discussed, they were now the nobles. And they were the guys that owned most of the land. And they also had titles, and they saw themselves as being very, very important. And they had a lot of special rights. Hunting, for instance, they were the only ones allowed to hunt, even if you were very poor. And there was a lot of game around at the time. You were not allowed to hunt, and it was illegal to hunt. And if they caught you hunting, you would be punished either by being whipped or even being put to death. It says there they owned large pieces of land and held all the main positions in the church, the army, and in government. And then, of course, there was the third estate, and those were the ordinary people. It's the rest of the population, and they accounted for about 98% of the population belonged to this estate, and they paid all the taxes, even though they earned the least amount of money and almost owned no land. They had to pay all the taxes. And they felt now it was their labor that kept the whole system together, and they were quite right. This is now the third estate. And it's by 1789, they were very critical of these privileges of the other estates. And by the third estate was then also divided into a middle class, urban workers, and peasants. The middle class, or the bourgeoisie, were business people. They say that again, there's a big word, it's called bourgeoisie, it's called middle class. Were business people, doctors, lawyers, and they lived in the towns. Some of them were very wealthy, well qualified to be in high government positions, but these positions were nearly always went to the nobles. All right. So even though there were people more qualified to run the country and would have done a much better job, it was more to do with who you were and who your father were if you were going to get a good position in the government, not if you were able to do it. And that was a problem. And it's a problem that we're still struggling with today to a large extent. The middle class then became frustrated and wanted appointments to be made on merit. They also wanted freedom of speech, equality before the law. And the factory workers, mainly in Paris, and they became unhappy with the lack of pay increases. So there was a lot of unhappiness, and frustration was building up. The peasants, as we now saw, were the largest group of people in France. Most of them worked on farms owned by the church or the nobles, but they were very poor. But as we have said now a couple of times, they had to pay all the taxes. Some of them paid up to 80% of their income to taxes. Now imagine you get 1,000 Rand a month as a salary, and you had to pay 800 Rand of that 1,000 Rand in taxes. Or if you get 10,000 Rand a month, you had to pay 8,000 Rand of the 10,000 Rand into taxes. So that leaves you very little to actually look after yourself and your family. So by 1789, the peasants were desperate and ready to take action. All right, now the next slide there is it's a cartoon, and now we haven't really discussed cartoons. So we're briefly going to look at this cartoon. It's called a political cartoon, and political cartoons, unlike the cartoons that you watch on DSTV and on Cartoon Network, actually has a point, and it tells us a story, and it makes a political point. Now there we can see the old man with the bent back, and there's two other characters sitting on his back. Now the two characters sitting on his back, the one in front, you'll see is holding a cross here by his neck. Therefore, he represents the clergy, the people of the church. And the one behind him with the big feathered hat, that will now be the nobles. And the old man with the bent back, that represents the peasants. And it tells us that the peasants had to carry the burden of the nobility and of the clergy, and that they were starting to break and their backs were starting to be broken by the weight of the nobility and of the clergy. So that's just to give you an idea of at the time, and this cartoon was drawn at the time. So that gives its primary source, drawn at the time, and it shows us what the political feeling at the time was. All right, there we just have a quick idea of the three estates, where we can see that the clergy, there, if I can point, there's the clergy. You can see that the clergy were the least amount of people. But if you look at land and ownership, you see there that they owned, even though there were so few, they owned quite a bit of land. And then if we look here at the commoners and the taxation, see there's the big green line, green column, and that shows us the amount of taxes that the common, the third estate, had to pay. And there you see the population of the third estate, and there we can see the population of the clergy and the nobility, very, very low. And look there, the taxation, there's no tax. They paid absolutely no tax, even though they own so much of the land. There's the clergy, there's nobility. Look how few they are, but how much of the land they owned. But they paid absolutely no tax. So that's an important graph for you to just have a look at and understand. All right, there's our three estates, just a little picture there. Of course, we've got the clergy. That guy there, you can see the cross, tells you that is the clergy. This side here, we've got the nobility. We notice the nobility, you can see how they dressed. Very fancy, interesting dress. We've spoken about the dress of people at different times. And here we can see how the French nobility dressed at the time. Very flamboyant, colorful, especially the dresses. They were quite spectacular. And then, of course, here we've got the third estate, where you can see it's just ordinary people wearing ordinary clothing. And there you can see the sort of the difference in the three estates. Right, first activity you need to do is on page 69, activity 1. I hope that you've watched my video and I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'm going to make some more and I will post it, and you can have a look, and hopefully it will help you to understand the work a bit better before you jump into those activities. Thanks guys, have a good day.